All right, leader of learning, I have an exciting guest here, Craig Randall, who I think has an amazing idea for a new book coming out, and really, and we were just actually talking a little bit before we hit record here, somewhat of a disruption at a time when I think education in some ways, for all intents and purposes, is starving for some disruption, and really, what no better time. And we'll talk all about that in a minute. But Craig, I'm happy to have you here. And before we get going on talking about all that sort of stuff, why don't you introduce yourself? I understand that you are a former school administrator, so you've probably been in this game for a while. But who you are, where you are, and what do you do?
All right, my name is Craig Randall. I live in Tacoma, Washington right now. I've had a really varied career, I think, educationally. I started out as a school counselor, elementary level, did a year of middle school in the classroom with kids that all had severe behavior disabilities. They'd all but one been adjudicated already. It was crazy. I coached along the way, had a chance to do some college coaching. And so I detoured and did 7 years of small college basketball coaching. And then my wife and I decided to fulfill a lifelong dream, and we went overseas and started teaching overseas. And I got my administrative certificate. And then we worked our way around from Poland to Korea to the Middle East to Brazil and back here. And I wrote a book.
That's awesome, and I didn't realize that part of your story that you had been overseas, and certainly not to that many areas. And I'm wondering, even before we get into sort of the meat and potatoes here, what are some of the things that you noticed about the different education systems?
Well, we were at international schools, and so you're definitely following a Western American style education system. I'd say the IB is much more popular there. Like there's no AP for the most part. Korea had it. Certainly, you could throw out broad stereotypes in terms of maybe rote memory and more of the Asian, and then having to build the student into the inquiry and creativity. Um, but really, I think kids are kids. It was maybe more diverse for sure, but school is school.
Hmm. That's really fascinating. A little while back, I did an episode with Taru Clavel, who has become somewhat of an expert and an outspoken advocate for really American schools trying to emulate what schools around the globe are doing. And so I am interested to know what other areas do. So that's really cool. Now, to get into what I know we wanted to discuss here, which is basically a different approach to teacher observations and evaluations. What I wanted to start talking about, though, first, before we even get there, and to build up to it a little bit, is this idea of trust, because I know you're really big into it, and I have a little experience in being a school administrator. You probably have much more than I, but I know how important that is, not just from my lived experiences, but also from my own research as well. And in my research on leadership practices to inspire a growth mindset, I know that was an underlying theme in my research and some of the other research that's out there. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what is it about trust? How do we get there, and why is it so important?
It's pretty simple to me. I mean, I wouldn't say I knew this all along, but discovered it through the practice that I accidentally developed. But when teachers trust, when anyone's willing to trust, we're more willing to be vulnerable. Like I think Brene Brown talking about vulnerability. So if I'm trust enough that I feel safe, then I'm more willing to take a chance on something big to improve or innovate my practice. And it helps build growth mindset, just like you're talking about. When the trust isn't there, and I definitely argue that the current models inhibit trust instead of building trust, then people have a tendency to pull back and play it safe.
All right, I don't want to. I can't go past that without coming back to it. You made a pretty big claim there. And actually, I'm going to come back to another bold claim you made in a couple minutes too. But you
Uh
basically
oh.
just said that the current model really, and I know I'm putting words in your mouth a little bit, but basically, the current model does not do a good job of allowing school leaders, school administrators, to be able to build trust. And I guess I'm just going to ask why, or why not.
I think there's two main reasons I came across my research. And I'll say this, I did the research as I was writing the book because I'd already developed the model, but luckily I found things that supported it. So one, there's a man named Matt O'Leary, who's a researcher and university professor in the UK, and he did a whole bunch of qualitative research that found that as soon as you start to evaluatively grade or rate, because I know some people will say, well, I'm not grading them, I'm just putting them on a developmental scale, but it doesn't really matter. It's perceived as that people stop taking risks. They play it safe. So that's one big thing. And then the other thing is the Gates Foundation had a 7-year, $200 million study to develop a more robust teacher evaluation process with the hope of improving teaching, learning, and graduation outcomes. 7 years, $200 million. At the end of 2008, there was a Rand report that said there was no sustainable, measurable, significant improvement. So it's not that it's not well intended. It's just these things get in the way and cause teachers to play it safe.
And it's just not doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? Let me flip the coin a little bit, and
Yeah,
this is not one of my devil's advocate episodes, but let me just play devil's advocate for a second.
fair enough. Yep,
Um, Students,
yep.
unfortunately, what we know, and I have not done this research, but I do know that there are some experts out there who will say that unfortunately students are, or a lot of students are, driven by, motivated by those kind of quote unquote rewards like grades. Are you saying it's the opposite for teachers? Is there a difference?
I would say a couple of things. I think research tends to say that teachers aren't driven by monetary. We all want to make a decent living, but they're not driven by that. So those ideas that are out there that will give somebody a bonus if their students achieve a certain score, not even getting to the ridiculous of if you don't teach one of those two subjects of literacy or math. So that doesn't drive teachers. So I mean, I think O'Leary's researchers would say it actually causes them to pull back. And I'll even extend it further and say, if we think about the model of how we're supposed to give the best feedback to kids versus and compare it to what we're doing with administrators, it's a huge hypocrisy.
I'm really glad you brought up that word feedback, and we'll come back around to that as well. And the other bold statement you made, which you kind of touched on here, so I won't really ask you specifically, but when we emailed back and forth to set up this interview, what you said, and I think backing up the statements that you've just made, is, in a nutshell, research makes it clear that observation models, as they currently function, are not improving teaching and learning. And I think, in my opinion, back me up here. One of the reasons why is exactly what you just said, because I think that when you put grades and ratings on an evaluation, what tends not to happen, or at least not as much as it should, or at least not as effectively as it should, is that feedback piece. Am I right?
Or I think it becomes a one-way feedback where we there? Yeah. Okay. So the feed, I forget the question. Sorry
That's
about
okay.
that.
I was saying if feedback really needs to happen more so in
Okay.
terms.
So right. So the way the feedback tends to work now is it's me as the observer just feeding you and giving you all your ratings, all the different pedagogical category, and then telling you things to get better. I'm not saying that people won't touch on strengths, but it's just human nature when we hear the things at first that we're being told aren't that good of a score, we tend to not even hear the good things because I'm so focused on the stuff that, oh, I wish I would have done better, and realize that's one time out of what percentage of teaching.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it gets in the way. People don't pay attention. I'll say just real quick, jumping ahead maybe a little, like the reflective conversation is where the trust is built. It's not in the observation itself, but the first two questions I always ask are first two things. I come into your room so you feel safer. I ask permission to have the conversation, and then I make sure I sit beside you, not across from you. I let you look at the feedback form and watch me type as I do it. So I'm doing everything there to set up trust and transparency. But then I always start by asking, What were you doing to help students learn? And if you had the chance to teach the lesson again, what, if anything, might you do differently? So instantly, what am I doing? I'm not telling you, I'm asking, I'm listening. So you feel more valued as a professional. Well, I'm also setting the expectation that reflection is a part of practice.
If I were this is the teacher in me. If I were to look at like a Venn diagram, right, and you got your sort of traditional old school observation methods, and now you have this idea that you've written a book on, it's coming out soon, you've done this research on trust based observations. What are the big differences?
Okay, so we eliminate the pre-conference observation because we want it to be authentic, and it's just human nature. If I know you're coming in, even if I'm really, really great, I'm still going to put a little more effort
It
in.
kind of
So
eliminates the dog and pony show
it,
aspect of it.
I believe so.
Hmm.
Uh, they're shorter. They're 20 minutes. The list of checks for pedagogical areas is only 9. Research says when there's more than 10, I lose the teaching looking for the individual trees. So it's manageable, measurable. We have a student interview in there to check for learning targets. So it's short. We have follow-ups the next day. It's continuous too. So there's a very set pattern. My wife always says, you've systematized it. There's 12 observations a week, 3 observations Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 3 follow-ups Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, follow Friday. And so you're just continually working through. And then by asking those questions, let me add one other thing that builds trust. The first 3 visits, definitively, I will only notice what I saw. And we don't rate. We just notice what we saw. So it might not be the highest level, but it's evidence of up. Granted, sometimes you have to search harder for them. I readily admit that, but not that often. And so I ask those questions. I share what I saw as strengths. What ends up happening frequently, really over 50% of the time, is by the end of the third one, sometimes sooner, they'll start saying, okay, but what can I get better at? So at that point, you know they're starting to trust you and feel safe. You've talked to genuinely about things you saw that you liked. I'll add to that, as you're going in so much over the course of a year or years, you really start to know who's really good at what. So then you can start to empower those teachers and connect that to your PD too. All that together, it builds trust.
I also think it builds up something that is still lacking in the traditional observation and evaluation model, and really in professional learning in general, which is in an individualization and differentiation that we're asking
Thank you.
teachers to do for students, but still, I just in my personal experiences, I don't see enough administrators doing for teachers.
That's a great point because I think that's exactly what this does. Each teacher is different. Each strengths that each teacher has different. One of the things that I think I've discovered just being an observer so much is there's way more than one way to be an amazing, excellent teacher. I've seen teachers that are lecturers that are not very good. I mean, I'm sorry, that are really, really good. And it seems a little more traditional, but they've got things like relentlessness and heart for kids. And I've seen teachers that are all kinds of other things too. But each teacher, we can work off their strengths. I originally called it strengths-based observations before I realized trust was really the core of it. But building off of those, then we can work with each teacher to help them get better, whatever that might mean for that teacher.
Yeah. I was wondering as you were talking, is there maybe one aspect of this model, as you call it, that's potentially more important or more valuable in terms of that trusting relationship that would be most effective for a teacher?
Most in my building a relationship with the teacher.
And having that teacher trust you the observer, the administrator, in terms of really helping them to be a better educator. Is it the feedback or the reflective conversations afterwards? Is it?
I mean, for sure, the trust is built in the reflective conversation. Everything that I said that goes into it, even the little things about asking permission, sitting beside, letting them see as I type so it's transparent, even if they're saying things in non pedagogical language, changing it to, and making sure that it meets with their permission, all of it, listening first, asking the questions. All of those things are the pieces that build, and being patient. Like people will want to, when I've worked with some people before, like they'll want to start giving feedback right away. It's like, it's okay. I mean, there are exceptions for safety, obviously, and when you have really deep concerns. But I just think the whole process of the reflective conversation within the framework that I set out.
Yeah, no, that's really great. It actually reminds me quite a bit when you said, especially the piece about asking more questions and being patient before offering suggestions or really giving some of that critical feedback. It reminds me of a book I read and a blog post I wrote, and I think I even may have done a podcast episode on called The Coaching Habit. And
Mm.
essentially, to boil down all of the ideas in that book, it really comes down to just asking more and more questions and just really allowing for that reflection to happen. And essentially at the same time, you've said quite a bit, is building up that trust. And so the teacher does not feel like you're forcing anything upon them, doesn't feel like you're trying to take over. They take ownership of their own learning. And I think that's what you're getting at here as well. It's that teacher being in the quote unquote driver's seat of their own professional development.
I mean, I think ideally we'd like them to discover the area that maybe we see as the one they'd like. And sometimes with questions, you can get them to identify it. But even so, by saying, hey, would you like to hear a suggestion, asking permission, that matters. And I'll tell you, sometimes there's teachers, and you can feel it, teachers that have been teaching, particularly to stereotype, longer, where I'll wait up to literally an entire year. By that point in time, like I've given you fair game. But if I sense that that's reluctance is there, then why push it before it might pull them back? And the other thing is, I think in some ways we look at traditional models or even the model that I'm talking about, we see teachers so little. What if I don't see something the first three, four times that happens to be a strength? I just didn't say it then, and then I offer suggestion in that. What happens to the building of relationship then? I think it's just hard to build, easily destroyed.
Yeah, yeah. Um, if I may play devil's advocate one more time, what about administrators out there who would say, I don't, how am I going to find the time to go into all these teachers' classrooms this often? Or
Yeah.
teachers or teachers' unions who say, excuse me, Mr. or Mrs. Administrator, you're not allowed to be in my teachers' classrooms that often.
I'll tell you, I think one of the ways that I was able to build the model was being in international schools where there's more flexibility and you're more like a speedboat instead of a big tanker. And so I think there will be issues with that at first. And so I think in areas, well, let me touch the time piece first. So if we're saying the visits are 20 minutes, that's three a day. So that's an hour. There's planning time, say an hour and 15. And then the follow ups are in roughly an hour each. So that's saying Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's 2 hours. Monday and Friday, it's an hour. I think we have that time. And certainly we do now when we're not having to put out the fires. And when I would argue that teachers could use our support more than ever. But in terms of the unions and the unions part, yeah, that's going to be a thing where hopefully we get early adopters or people that really buy into it, and we can get superintendents and principal supervisors that can talk about piloting a school. I think when teachers start to feel it, it feels so much more positive, encouraging that they'll embrace it and go for it. But I agree; those are issues to be overcome potentially.
I have to say that I'm just about to start my 15th year in education, and I think at this point I've spent just as much time, if not more time, out of the classroom than I've spent in either some sort of a coaching role or even for a bit, an administrator, and I do think that teachers, much more often than not, are very willing to allow people to come in and visit and observe, especially if, of course, especially if there's that trust that's been built up between them, but also especially if the teacher knows that something like tangible is going to come out of it. And hopefully that something tangible is, like you've already talked about, those kind of reflective conversations, or at the very least just some kind of idea for them to build on, even if there is a little bit of a criticism in there. Again, like over half my career now, and i could probably I can definitely count on one hand, and maybe even just a couple of fingers, how many teachers I think have been resistant to having visitors in their classroom and observers.
And I think if you add to that, when you do offer a suggestion, you're prepared to offer the specific ways you're willing to provide support, whether that's an article, a book, hooking up with an expert teacher in your building, or sending them to a training, or whatever that might be. Then you're also showing that it's totally about support and growth, not
I
about critical and catching you doing bad things.
Yeah, I agree. That's huge right there, and it takes time, right, to build that trust. I think the
Mm-hmm.
first couple of times you come in a classroom, I don't think it's there yet, but yeah, I mean, that's the idea of visiting more often than not. As we start to wrap up here, I definitely want you to plug the book and talk about the book. We've already talked a lot about the ideas that, of course, you've put in there and some of the research that have led you to this model of trust-based observations. I'm getting excited about the book, and I have read that you have been endorsed by people like John Hattie, Michael Fullen, Carol Dweck, John Gordon, among others. So it's building up some steam, I think, already. And I think it is, you and I discussed before hitting record the notion of, I think I put the term out there, sort of a disruption to the observation models that have existed, traditionally speaking. And I think there's no better time than right now to really, buck the system and try and disrupt the system because, hey, COVID's done that anyway. But anyway, talk to us about the book and some of the ideas that you're looking to get across.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's called Trust Based Observations. It comes out on September 15th with the paperback. The ebook and hardback are available now. You can get them on Amazon. So I'm really excited about that. I think we've talked a lot about just the general, very broad outline of the model. But I think if we think about like teachers and even the model of observation, what other job in the world does someone you don't go into the coffee shop as the manager, pull down a chair, a laptop, watch the barista make coffee for an hour, evaluatively rate them on things, and then give them back feedback, which could potentially influence whether they're employed there. So I think like part of the emphasis of the book is we have to have empathy for teachers and the amazing job they do and the vulnerability that is the observation processes. And it's about teaching and learning. And I'm convinced from my own personal experience with this, teachers will make amazing strides in changing in big, innovative ways what they're doing that influences teaching and learning.
I don't even want to go much farther with this because one of the things you just said there, I think, is the golden nugget in everything that you've said. Not that the rest wasn't important, but you literally said these words. It's about teaching and learning. And isn't that why we got into this profession? Not because we want our kids to learn, but because we want to continue to learn as well, to learn how to be great at what we do so we can make our students great at what they do. And I think that was absolutely priceless. And if and when I get around to taking a clip of this episode and putting it out, the audio and the video, that's definitely what I grab because that was absolutely gold. Craig, I really thank you for your time. Congratulations on the book and in advance, I guess, of its official release. But I think the idea is great. And again, as I said a few minutes ago, I think there's no better time to try new things, try and disrupt, try and just get out of old bad habits and into new ones that as you just said again, really will not only emphasize but improve the teaching and learning process. I really appreciate your time. Where can people connect to you? And of course, I'll have links in the show notes to where they can purchase the book and all that. But if they want to connect with you, do you have a website? Do you have social media?
Yeah, I have www.trustbase.com, or you can email me at craig@trustbase.com. I'm on LinkedIn, Craig Randall, and I'm working on getting better at the other social media stuff.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, again, all those links to Craig's website, the book, the social media that he's working on, all that will be in the show notes for this episode. This was, as my friend Brad Schreffler, who is also a fellow podcaster, says, sort of a podcasting blind date. We had not met before, but I'm glad that we connected like this. I think it's a great idea. I'm sure it'll be a great book when it comes out officially. Just thank you so much for being an awesome guest on the show.
Thank you so much, Dan. I really appreciate what you're doing because you're helping to get out word and spread the word on improving teaching and learning too.
Thank you.